talking about, how do you see the impact of the crowd funds and aspiring new business angels? It's been extremely encouraging as an Aussie to come to London and talk to the new category of investor. It's been very, very cool, but I'm interested in kind of how you see it, how you see that impacting what you were just talking about. So for those of us that are not chasing VCs, but we are talking to these guys, how do you see that impacting the growth of the sector?
Is that asking me?
I guess it is sort of a Mark question, but also to the wider panel, because you did all mention,
Yeah. Maybe I just comment that very quickly now, and then I'll sorry, I'm just trying to follow the conversation a little bit. I'm really excited by that possibility, and I think it's going to become more and more important. The Kiva founders, are our Chauffeur fellows now, because we recognise that they have a great idea, and I think there'll be a lot more like that. But the reason why I think it's particularly important is this. If you look at the financing chain that exists for commercial enterprises, there's a very clear trade-off between risk and reward. So early stage seed capital, very high risk but very high return potential. As you move up the chain, private equity and so on, returns might come down a little bit, but at the same time the risk is removed. If you're looking at the financing chain for social enterprises, that link is broken. Right? At the early stage, you have massive risk, but the return potential is not there necessarily for a lot of these organizations. Now, classic venture capital will not fill that gap. Therefore, you need to look at other sources of funding that can fund that missing market, if you like. Now, I think that could be the angel social market, which is developing very rapidly here in Europe in particular. But things like crowdfunding could be part of the solution to filling that gap. And that's one of the key bottlenecks, I think, in why the social enterprise market is not developing as quickly as it could.
Actually, those of you interested, Danai was the charming founder of Indiegogo, which is kind of the second leading platform. She's in London at the moment because they launched in some new languages and so on. So on Saturday, she'll be at this NECU Social Enterprise Conference. So those of you who are interested, she's a very charming speaker, and I'm sure you'll be all excited about it. And especially,
What's the name of the conference?
It's the Tata Social Enterprise Conference.
NACUE. She's a student.
Yeah, and it's. I think it's really interesting because she talks a lot about also how you as a social enterprise can create the right incentives to get backers on board. So how do you create a narrative? How do you create right perks to because you can't give out equity, so how can you give out perks and these things? So I think that's interesting.
Two questions. Basically, I was recently in Tanzania researching a social enterprise I want to develop there. And one of the things I found is that a lot of donors are still funding and encouraging business plan competitions. Everyone seems to have mentioned the traditional business plan is dead. I understand this, the traditional banking system still asks for it for funding purposes, etc., but it doesn't work. It actually left a lot of farmers who wanted to get funding disheartened because at the end of it, there was nothing for them. How do you sort of use your collective knowledge and advise the donors that you need to be plowing your money into more effective solutions? Secondly, there's a lot of chatter in IBM about big data. What's actually happening and what is the business case of trying to make that open source for people in developing economies, for NGOs, etc., where funding is a big issue? That's it. 2 questions.
I'll take the second one, and you can say the first one.
The business plan is definitely a really interesting one. And I mean, putting my solar investor hat on, for example, I mean, we see hundreds of business plans every day. And you're absolutely right there. I've never seen any that ever actually got realised. I mean, the business plan is obsolete almost the day it's written, and that's true. But this is the thing, though. I think business plans are actually misunderstood and misinterpreted, because I don't look at a business plan as a roadmap of how this company will evolve over the next 5 years, actually, if I'm an investor coming into that. I look at the business plan as a sanity check on what's possible and whether it's feasible. So if I'm looking at an entrepreneur who's saying, look, here are going to be our sales in our first year, second year, third year, etc., and to deliver that, our overheads are going to be X and Y, it's not that I think that's actually what will happen. It's that rather that I look at that and I say, do I really think they're going to ship 25,000 units in the next 6 months? or not? What would that mean in terms of margin, cost, overhead, etc.? Can they redo that with 3 people, etc.? And it's a very good way to sanity check the scenarios. But we don't. So I think investor education, and I think investors are coming more and more into this. It's not, don't give me a business plan because that's what you will achieve. It's give me a business plan so I can sanity check it, and that's the spirit which I think they should be offered and discussed. So I don't think we can do away with it, but I don't think no one seriously thinks, particularly for the base of the pyramid, that is going to be how it's going to be for the next 5 years, because we all know it isn't.
Big data. So the World Bank has had a big initiative on open data. It's been running a few years, and now you can download an app on your iPhone and you can access huge amount. I've got the full suite of World Bank apps here. I can download poverty stats on almost any country in the world. Amazing amount of detail. That's the structured set of data, and you can say that different institutions, private sector, public sector, third sector, can all share data to increase this big pot of data everyone's got access to. The really interesting set for me is the unstructured data that comes from the crowd. It talks about Kiva being a crowd innovation for the donor community, but the actual beneficiary community and the interactions that are now possible through mobile phone questionnaires and more innovative models like ipaidabbribe.com in India. You might know. There's one in Rio that the guys have been talking to, Rio Watch, where they can report sort of public safety issues. So that is the crowd pumping more data into this big pot. You asked what was the business model. Well, I think the business model for organisations like OBM is making sense of that, because even though I've got all this information access to it, being able to make more informed and timely decisions, whether I'm acting as a corporate leader looking to invest in these countries, or if I'm a donor looking at where my donor funds can best go.
It wasn't so much about the business model, it's what's the business model to make it open source. I was working on a project M-Pharma type project in Tanzania, and what we found was that we were developing and creating data that was relatively free for farmers, etc., but we were also selling it to the likes of Tigo and Vodacom, etc., and they were making a lot of money out of it. So it's on one hand, there is a business case of making it open source and easily accessible to people at the bottom of the pyramid, but on the other case, the big organizations who should be providing this information for free aren't. And so, there's a lot of talk about getting all this information from IBM, and I just wanted to find out what the business case may be to make it open source. Is anyone looking at that, or is that?
Well, the GSM sort of group, which the industry body for mobile phone operators, they have a development foundation. GSMA, that's all. So they are in little pockets of projects around the world. They're making the data fully open to see what business models can be built on.
Not really. Not really. I was working on a GSMA partly funded project, and we found, because they were working with Tigo was buying this data and then selling it off. And they were making a lot of profit from text messages, which is quite high in developing countries.
So is that GSMA the core organisation or the foundation? Because the foundation is...
Oh, okay. Not the foundation. It was basically GSMA and Technoserve and Tigo working on an agreement.
So they're representing their telecom clients. So the question is, why would a telco share this huge amount of data that they've got for the good of development? And I think, apart from the goodwill of them as an organisation, you've got to find the right incentives, and that's the challenge that we're always going to face. Like the shareholders of a telco company, some of those shareholders would be more than happy for their company that they invest in to play a part in the development, but some of them just want a return on investment, and the highest return on investment means that they charge for sharing that data. So I'm not answering your question, I'm just recognising it as an issue.
Yeah.
Have you come across Thomson Reuters? Because I know that they share information about weather forecasts with farmers. So, do you know much about what?
A lot of people do provide that information for free, because what's happening, they're making their returns on the text messages. So in developing economies, text messages are quite high cost, especially across network. Data at the moment is very cheap, like it used to be in the UK. It used to be incredibly cheap. Now we get less data for more money. So that's a lot of the data they do try and provide free, but they're making their money in other ways, which is through text messages. So that's the same with Thomson Reuters.
On a general point, when you get market failures, like we've just discussed them, that's where you need either the third sector or the public sector to intervene. And so, I mean, off the top of my head, you could say that you only get a 3G license in our country if you make the data freely available. Because that's not your core model, that's not your core business model. You make money on airtime sales. The data, if you want this contract, needs to be available to the developing community in the country. One alternative.
It becomes a political game then.
If the market failures, you need a public third sector solution.